considering negative energy charges and negative electromagnetic energy. We must also consider persistent negative energy charges, such as Dirac's negative energy electron, as source charges, producing associated negative energy electromagnetic potentials. These slightly persistent negative energy electrons, they are not positrons, since they have not yet interacted with mass, are negative energy source charges producing negative energy electromagnetic fields and potentials. Unknown to Kondeputy and Prigogine, and to other thermodynamicists, these negative energy source charges and their resulting negative energy electromagnetic fields and potentials can and do occur in strong gradient processes, such as Bedini's sharp discharge pulses or spikes, and they do have a finite persistence time during such spikes if the section of the circuit they occur in has an independent floating ground. Hence, during their persistence they produce usable negative energy electromagnetic fields and negative energy electromagnetic potentials. In turn, together with the E-amp effect in circuits with adroit isolation of pulse charging section grounds, this allows a startling new negative energy mechanism for charging batteries and powering systems with remarkable power and rapidity, for very little positive energy dissipation by the operator. Even peak pulse powers of 300 kilowatts are usable and achievable, with most of the energy being freely furnished from the vacuum environment via the E-amp effect. In normal common ground, closed-loop circuits, the negative energy holes are shorted directly to ground, interacting with mass in that electrical ground and changing to positrons, with positive mass and positive energy. This immediately kills the negative energy electromagnetic fields and potentials. Or looked at another way, in the internal vacuum energy interval between a positive energy electron and a negative energy electron, there is a continuum of positive energy electromagnetic field above the zero reference, and a continuum of negative energy electromagnetic field below the zero reference. Common grounding and closed current loop circuitry effectively blocks the use of this continuum. Floating ground in the asymmetric vacuum portion of the circuit, where one deals with negative energy, is essential so that the negative energy electromagnetic fields can be sustained and not extinguished. Negative electromagnetic energy in general behaves exactly opposite to our familiar positive electromagnetic energy. Deliberate use of negative converging electromagnetic energy as compared to positive diverging electromagnetic energy allows passage of very large converging electromagnetic negative energy currents through tiny wires, resistors, against back EMFs, etc. This enables the use of extraordinarily powerful negative energy electromagnetic pulses for charging a battery or capacitor very rapidly. It also enables the E-amp effect, in which resistive and inductive sections serve as amplifiers immediately, while capacitive sections gradually grow the local E-amp effect, usually over a dozen or more hours. Note that the batteries are also capacitors, and so the process does gradually condition the immediate vacuum environment of the batteries, so that the E-amp effect appears in the batteries also. This negative energy and the Dirac C, as used in this novel battery charging invention, trace back to Dirac's electron theory. The invention deliberately utilizes a negative entropy process that transduces excess reordering and usable electromagnetic energy from disordered electromagnetic energy of the vacuum. It is a new field of technology, not previously considered in battery charging or in powering of electromagnetic circuits and devices or in electrodynamics itself. Some electromagnetics and physics background. Introduction. The invention uses characteristics of extended higher group symmetry electrodynamics not present in ordinary electrical engineering texts and classical electrodynamics texts, but present in physics, including quantum field theory, gauge field theory, and non-equilibrium thermodynamics. It also utilizes negative energy electromagnetic fields and potentials, and negative energy currents. Hence an overview of the process's novel electrical physics is required, as well as some history of how classical electrodynamics and electrical power engineering came to be so unreasonably restricted. Some classical electrodynamics history. Maxwell-Heaviside electrodynamics was formally initiated in a paper by Maxwell in 1865, containing his theory unifying electrical theory and magnetic theory as 20 quaternion and quaternion-like equations in 20 unknowns. Another Maxwell paper in 1864 is of interest. Here Maxwell used an electrical derivation of his theory instead of the previous dynamic derivation. Maxwell's book first edition followed in 1873. At the time there were less than 3 dozen scientists worldwide who could understand Hamilton's quaternions, because worldwide there were only about 3 dozen capable electrodynamicists. Consequently, there was open scientific hostility to quaternion algebra. Heavily pressured by his publisher and peers to simplify the quaternion-like mathematics, Maxwell prepared most of a much simpler manuscript that was published in 1881 after Maxwell's premature death in 1879. The second edition of Maxwell's full treatise was also published after his death and incorporated severe simplifications, as did the third edition. Heaviside, perhaps the major architect of modifying Maxwell's theory, was a self-taught genius who never attended university. He was still teaching himself differential equations when Maxwell's first edition of his treatise was published in 1873. After Maxwell's death, several scientists, notably Heaviside, Gibbs, and Hertz, dramatically reduced the equations to much simpler vector equations, leaving the higher group symmetry quaternion algebra behind, an action Maxwell himself had also begun under pressure prior to his death in 1879. It is Heaviside's equations and notation that are taught as Maxwell's equations in the standard undergraduate electrodynamics texts today. In the 1890s there occurred a short and sharp debate, mostly in the journal Nature, between the vectorists and the few quaternionists such as Peter Guthrie Tait. The quaternion approach was just abruptly abandoned by the oncoming electrodynamicists in favor of the new and much simpler vector approach. The reduction of Maxwell's theory to vector algebra was a substantial reduction in topology, hence it produced a topological subset of the original Maxwell theory. Beginning with his doctoral thesis in 1875, Lorentz further truncated the Heaviside equations arbitrarily, by symmetrically Riga-Eugeing them, so that closed analytical solutions might be obtained and numerical methods usually avoided. This symmetrical Riga-Eugeing in fact nullifies any receipt and effective use of excess energy by a Maxwellian system from its external vacuum environment, although it implicitly assumes that the potential energy of the system is freely changed, Riga-Eugeed, twice by precisely such Riga-Eugeing energy freely received from its active environment. In electrical power engineering today, the symmetrically Riga-Eugeed and highly simplified equations of classical electrodynamics are used. Every electrodynamicist accepts that the potential and potential energy of an electromagnetic system can be freely changed at will, without work. However, he also usually insists that it only be done just so, where both potentials Fe and A are changed, and where the two new free force fields that emerge are equal and opposite. That way, all the excess Riga-Eugeing energy is locked up as a charge in the stress in the system. The excess energy is there, but it has passed into stress energy and is no longer available to perform translation work in the load. This weird arrangement, to accept even enormous extra energy freely from the Riga-Eugeing environment, but to deliberately lock it up so that it cannot be put to practical use and perform useful work in the load, is an inexplicable self-imposed destruction of easily obtaining copious electromagnetic energy from the vacuum via asymmetrical Riga-Eugeing for free. That it continues to be universally upheld and enforced, defies the human imagination. Paraphrasing Tesla, it is one of the most inexplicable aberrations of the scientific mind that has ever been recorded in history. This means that no free net force resultant, due to the excess energy freely received from the vacuum, is allowed to exist in the Riga-Eugeed circuit, to dissipate the excess free Riga-Eugeing energy by translating electrons as current and powering loads. Hence, today's electrical power systems are unable to effectively use their free extra Riga-Eugeing energy because it is always symmetrically received from the vacuum via equal and opposite energy flows immediately nullifying each other. If asymmetrically received, then the received Riga-Eugeing energy could indeed be used to freely power loads. Note that, to even make an inert circuit work, we do have to asymmetrically apply voltage, which is an asymmetrical Riga-Eugene. But we also are trained to employ the common ground closed current loop circuit with the source dipole of the external generator in the loop. That way, the circuit itself ruthlessly enforces gauge symmetry, and thus makes the back electromagnetic field equal to the forward EMF, preventing any use of the freely received extra Riga-Eugene energy to translate extra electrons freely and perform some free work in the loads. So Lorentz's arbitrary symmetry limitation is self-enforced by the closed current loop circuit, which provides the two equal and opposite Riga-Eugene forces in the form of the equal forward EMF and back EMF. Since the two always sum to a net EMF equal to zero, this insane circuit cannot use its excess vacuum energy to perform free work useful to the operator. Again, we are reminded of Tesla's characterization of the sheer stupidity of such an arrangement. It's rather like bringing home free groceries, locking them firmly in the pantry, and never touching them because one refuses to unlock the pantry. Small wonder then that one would have to continually pay for more groceries. Actually, to be complete, earlier L. V. Lorentz spelled without the letter T had independently derived the electrodynamic equations and had also done the symmetrical Riga-Eugene for which Lorentz, spelled with a T, was credited, while Lorentz's work was ignored. Jackson and Okun have formally clarified how Lorentz was and is erroneously credited with what Lorentz had already done before him. Theory of electromagnetic energy flow through space. In the 1880s, after Maxwell was already dead, two scientists, Heaviside and Poynting, independently and simultaneously developed the notion of the flow of electromagnetic energy through space, and formalized and published it. The electromagnetic energy associated with a circuit flows through space surrounding the conductors and outside them. The electrical current I is not part of the energy flow equation at all, although most engineering students have significant initial difficulty comprehending this, as pointed out by Heald and many others. Specifically, current is a part of the power voltage multiplied by current, which is the time rate of performing work. Hence the current is associated with the circuit's potential energy dissipation as work. Note that the word entropy originally meant the dissipation of potential energy. Asymmetric Riga-Eugene increases the potential energy freely, so it is the exact opposite of the entropy process, that is, it is a negative entropy process. A tiny Poynting fraction of this external electromagnetic positive energy flow is diverged into the circuit to potentialize the Drude electrons, and the electromagnetic fields drive the current through the circuit, with potentialization energy of the moving charges being dissipated in the circuit's loads and losses. The huge remainder of the electromagnetic positive energy flow, that is, the circular flow component discovered by Heaviside and unknown to Poynting, since Poynting only considered part of the flow that is diverged into the circuit to potentialize the electrons, is not diverged, because it is in curled field form. In a flat spacetime, assumed in the classical theory but seldom specifically pointed out, the divergence of the curl is zero in vector analysis. It is not necessarily zero when the local spacetime is curved, but classical electromagnetic completely omits this case by its assumption of flat spacetime. However, physics acknowledges that spacetime could be flat only if it were devoid of matter. Before his death, in unpublished papers, Heaviside had also considered gravitational implications of his extra curled field energy flow component. As Lathwaite pointed out, this may yet have tremendous impact on physics. Quoting Lathwaite, Heaviside had originally written the energy flow as electrical field multiplied by intensity of magnetic field plus G, where G is a circular flux. Poynting had only written electric field multiplied by magnetic field. Taking P to be the density of matter and E the intensity of a gravitational force, Heaviside found that the circular flux G can be expressed as Pu minus Ce, where U represents the velocity of P and C is a constant. When the extra Heaviside curled field energy flow component is accounted, every electrical generator and battery is already a coefficient of performance much greater than one energy converter, freely receiving enormous electromagnetic energy from the seething local vacuum and outputting it, but wasting almost all of it. The generator or battery terminals already output, into space surrounding the external circuit, many orders of magnitude more energy than the operator inputs by cranking the shaft of the generator or by having the battery dissipate internal chemicals. Our own rough estimate of the magnitude of the heaviside circuital component is that it is often a trillion or more times the magnitude of the Poynting diverged energy flow component that enters the circuit. Note again Evans' calculation of the enormous amount of energy available in the local curved spacetime due to the presence of mass. In the 1880s and 1890s, no possible source of this enormous extra heaviside energy flow in divergence-free form was known. Special and general relativity and curved spacetime were not yet born, and the very notion of active spacetime and active vacuum was unthinkable. Unable to solve the mystery of the source of heaviside's extra but huge non-diverged energy flow component, and unwilling to be labeled as a perpetual motion advocate, Lorentz simply originated a clever trick to dispose of the problem itself. He reasoned that the huge curled field energy flow component did nothing because it was not even diverted into the circuit. He believed it did not interact, and so he stated that it had no physical significance. Consequently, Lorentz integrated the entire energy flow vector around a closed surface assumed surrounding any volume element of interest. This effectively retained Poynting's divergent energy flow component, while arbitrarily discarding the non-diverged huge heaviside energy flow component, since it subtracted the outgoing heaviside energy flow component equal to the incoming heaviside energy flow component. Lorentz's original argument that such an enormous curled field energy flow component has no physical significance is still smoothly used by electrodynamicists to justify disposing of it, thus retaining the Maxwell-Heaviside assumption of a flat spacetime as a reasonable approximation. No one except Evans seems to have noticed that such enormous electromagnetic energy is indeed available in and around ordinary circuits due to their local curvature of spacetime. Experimental proof of Heaviside's extra energy flow component. This assumption, that there can be no physical significance of Heaviside's curled field energy flow, is rigorously true only for flat spacetime, which does not occur. It is experimentally falsified by the known and widely replicated negative resonance absorption of the medium in the field of optics. A typical experiment yielding coefficient of performance equal to 18 is given by boron, although scientists in that field carefully speak and write only of the reaction cross-section change, and do not point out that the thermodynamic coefficient of performance greater than 1. That way they are not accused of advocating violation of energy conservation. That is why they use the innocuous phrase negative resonance absorption of the medium rather than excess emission from the absorbing medium. When local space-time is curved, the divergence of the curl is not necessarily zero. In that case, a fraction of the arbitrarily discarded heaviside energy flow component that is diverged and therefore accounted. In such boron-type experiments in the infrared and ultraviolet, the input energy is oscillating. Further, the absorbing charged particles are in tuned particle resonance at that same input frequency. Voila! The very definition of field intensity, as determined by an interacting unit point static charge, is therefore altered. Indeed, the interaction, rigorously, its reaction cross-section is dramatically increased, just as surging a rock to and fro in a river's flow diverts more water flow than does the same rock when absolutely stationary. So some 18 times as much Poynting energy flow is remitted by the absorbing medium of the resonant particles, as is present in the Poynting component of the input energy calculated for the same particle when static. Yet energy is conserved at all times, since scientists do not account the huge heaviside energy flow input that actually was made by the operator. Though normally that extra flow does nothing, in the boron-type experiment it does do something. Specifically, its divergence becomes slightly non-zero and therefore some 18 times as much real electromagnetic energy is diverged into the detector circuit as is diverged for the non-resonant case. The other indirect but strong experimental evidence of Heaviside's enormous energy flow component is given by the recent Wilkinson microwave anisotropy probe measurements showing that the universe is comprised of 4% ordinary matter, 23% dark matter, and 73% dark energy. Such a startling percentage of dark negative energy is explicable by reaccounting the circuital heaviside energy flow component arbitrarily discarded by Lorentz a century ago. The Heaviside negative energy flow component from the Dirac sea holes persisting during sharp gradients is unaccounted and enormous. Huge astronomical explosions can persist for some little period, so that the enormous gradient also persists for some period. Hence the production of rather enormous amounts of negative energy in the unaccounted Heaviside negative energy flow component from the Dirac sea holes persisting during sharp gradients is unaccounted and enormous. Huge astronomical explosions can persist for some little period, so that the enormous gradient also persists for some period. Hence the production of rather enormous amounts of negative energy in the unaccounted Heaviside negative energy flow components during these persisting strong gradients. The inescapable conclusion is that the dark energy is negative energy, because it generates anti-gravity, thereby generating the unexpected but experimentally observed acceleration of the universe's expansion. Problem with the electrical power engineering model and corresponding circuits. The Maxwell-Heaviside-Lorentz theory still assumes the material ether, which has been falsified since the 1890s by the Michelson-Morley experiments. The original assumption of the material ether allowed a hydrodynamic material fluid theory, since supposedly there was not a single point devoid of mass in the entire universe. In turn, this resulted in erroneously assuming force fields in mass-free space, a fundamental error perpetuated in the electrical power engineering model to this day. It is well known that there exists no force devoid of mass, because mass is a component of force. By the definition, force equals change of momentum over time. As we previously pointed out, the expansion has two terms, both containing mass. We stated that the standard electrical power engineering theory assumes a flat spacetime, falsified by general relativity for nearly a century, and an inert vacuum, falsified by particle physics since the 1920s and 30s. It therefore specifies only those Maxwell-Lorentz systems, which effectively function, usually because of the use of the ubiquitous closed current loop circuit, as if they had no net active vacuum environment and no net active curved space-time environment. The entire electrical power engineering theory and industry thus assumes away much of the findings of modern particle physics. The industry's archaic electromagnetic model can only be upheld by the ubiquitous usage of the closed current loop circuit, which self-enforces symmetrical self-regauging, resulting in the topological subset of Maxwell's theory, previously referred to, corresponding to current electrical power engineering usage. A windmill analogy can be useful. So to speak, the conventional electrical power engineering model is like building a windmill inside a closed barn, so there can never be a free net environmental wind to use and do free work, regardless of the atmospheric winds present outside the self-restricting barn. In that case, the operator himself would have to pay to furnish external energy to rotate the blades and power the shaft and loads. From the well-known gauge freedom principle, nature does not require such an arduous self-limitation. But the electrical engineering model does require it, and electrical engineering practice enforces it, in every circuit and power system, and in the power grid itself. So to speak, use of the ubiquitous closed current loop circuit shuts the barn door and negates any net usable atmospheric wind by negating any free net force field appearing due to asymmetric self-regauging. That occurs even though two extra free force fields are still assumed by the regauging of the Maxwell-Heaviside equations, as are two changes of the potential energy of the system. But, the two fields are forcibly made equal and opposite, so they sum to a net zero translation vector summation. Hence, they cannot translate electrons as current, which is necessary to power system loads. The standard electrical power engineering model erroneously assumes an inert external vacuum and flat spacetime, which is the thermodynamic equivalent of an inert environment and therefore an isolated system. The model also assumes that all free regauging energy that does arise, because of the regauging of the Maxwell equations, is and can only be used to perform internal work on the system itself, to produce extra stress in the system. In short, it is like placing two equal rowers in a rowboat, one in front and the other in the rear, and having them row strenuously in opposite directions. Simply simultaneously producing greater but equal magnitudes of forward electromagnetic field and backward electromagnetic field, does nothing but increase the physical stress of the system. This further requires that all net energy utilized to regauge the potential energy of the system asymmetrically, so as to allow it to power its loads and losses, must be externally furnished as energy inputs to the system paid for by the operator himself, and not freely furnished from the environment. The model specifically locks up any and all usable extra energy inputs received from the active spacetime and active vacuum environment, even though such energy is readily received, and is received in every system. But the system itself has been deliberately designed in such a way that its freely received regaugeing energy from the environment can only do internal work on the system to produce excess stress of the system. The Lorentz symmetrical regaugeing of Maxwell's equations, that is, to the reduced topological subset, corresponding to lower group symmetry algebra, arbitrarily discarded all those permissible Maxwell systems, which freely and asymmetrically self-regauge themselves by receiving and using to power loads excess potential energy from their active environment and exhibiting a net non-zero free force along with it. Symmetrical regaugeing made the equations simpler and much easier to solve analytically, but at the expense of discarding all Maxwellian systems capable of exhibiting coefficient of performance greater than 1 or coefficient of performance equal to infinity by receiving and using excess electromagnetic energy from their vacuum environment. In short, it excluded all freely asymmetrically regaugeing Maxwellian systems from using that free energy to power loads. The ubiquitous closed current loop circuit forcibly makes the back electromagnetic field equal to the forward electromagnetic field, hence self-enforces Lorentz symmetrical regaugeing. With such a circuit, any Maxwellian system that does freely symmetrically regauge, receives extra energy from its vacuum environment twice, but it must and will use half the received energy in the external circuit to defeat any net use of the other half of the regaugeing energy freely received. In short, it uses its free regaugeing energy to increase the stress in the system, bypassing the forward electromagnetic field across the external source dipole. It is prohibited from using its free regaugeing energy to forcibly translate electrons as current and do useful free external work in the load. Free regaugeing, freely changing the potential energy of any electromagnetic system, does not have to be proven again. It is well established and already an axiom of quantum field theory and gauge field theory. All electrodynamicists use it, including Maxwell-Heaviside electrodynamicists and electrical power engineers. Any electromagnetic circuit or system, which fully obeys the symmetrical Maxwell-Heaviside Lorentz equations cannot output more usable energy than it receives from the operator himself, that is, from its external power source. It cannot just freely receive extra unobservable virtual photon energy from the active vacuum and asymmetrically regauge itself thereby. In thermodynamics terms, such a system is a system in self-enforced or self-restored equilibrium, hence maximizing its entropy and incapable of exhibiting negative entropy, self-ordering, coefficient of performance greater than 1, coefficient of performance equal to infinity, all being capabilities permitted to a system far from equilibrium in its energetic exchange with its active environment. One easily demonstrates that an asymmetrically self-regaugeing system can be powered by its active environment, providing coefficient of performance equal to infinity without any energy input by the operator. A circuit containing a load, and powered by a solar cell array is an example. Another is a windmill-powered load performing useful work. Indeed, when the river's energetic flow is included, a hydroelectric generator system and its entire transmission grid together with thousands of external loads being powered, is an example of a coefficient of performance equal to infinity electrical power system. Thermodynamically, such a system is far from equilibrium, hence is permitted to exhibit negative entropy relative to the operator's input energy. In short, the operator need input nothing at all, the active environment inputs it all. So some known electromagnetic systems in a known observable active environment, such as a solar cell in the observable sunlight, are able to perform coefficient of performance equal to infinity, since the operator need furnish no energy input at all. In this case, the observable environmental energy input simply replaces the operator's input that would otherwise be required. the efficiency of a typical solar cell may be only 17%, so that it wastes 83% of all the sunlight energy input to it. But since the operator inputs nothing, the coefficient of performance equals to infinity, and the solar cell array system with load is said to be self-powered by its active observable environment, not by the active non-observable vacuum. We point out that the solar radiation fields and potentials were generated by distant source charges on the Sun, and those source charges extracted all that solar energy from the local vacuum there at the Sun. So, even the solar cell array is fundamentally powered by electromagnetic energy originally extracted from the distant vacuum. All electromagnetic energy, in all electromagnetic fields, electromagnetic potentials, comes directly from the active vacuum via its interaction with the appropriate associated source charges. Areas known to violate the second law of thermodynamics. Condeputy and Prigogine list several areas already known and recognized to violate the second law of thermodynamics. These areas include rarefied media, where the local equilibrium concept fails, strong gradients, about which little is known, either theoretically or experimentally, and which are deliberately used in this invention, and long-lived memory effects in materials. The present invention uses the fact that strong gradients given by sharp pulses break the equilibrium of the vacuum itself and therefore break its symmetry, lifting some electrons from the Dirac and leaving some temporarily persisting Dirac holes. Because of this broken symmetry, some virtual energy has suddenly become observable energy. The holes in the vacuum do persist during the persistence of the sharp gradient, and often a bit longer. While they exist, the holes serve as negative energy source charges and thereby produce negative energy electromagnetic fields and potentials spreading at the speed of light. The negative energy electromagnetic fields and potentials from these persisting holes are directly used in the process of the invention to produce convergent energy flow, a flow of negative energy, as previously defined and described. The special characteristics of negative energy are then utilized so that even 300 kilowatt pulses of negative energy can safely be used to transiently charge batteries at an enormous rate, with almost all the energy being freely received in the battery from the externally symmetrical active vacuum environment. Negative convergent energy flow pulses of very large magnitude can be easily obtained and used to charge batteries or capacitors very quickly and impulsively, whereas such large magnitude pulses of positive divergent electromagnetic energy could not be used without probable battery or capacitor damage. Instead of destabilizing the battery's processes as would giant positive energy pulses, giant negative energy pulses further stabilize them as if momentarily riveting them to greater stability. Thus, by using large magnitude negative energy pulses, the invention is able to implosively and rapidly recharge and restabilize stabilized batteries and capacitors with these large peak intensities of negative energy furnished freely from the momentarily destabilized Dirac. A capacitor or battery does not care whether it is charged by positive energy charges induced onto one plate, or negative energy charges induced onto the other plate, or a combination of both simultaneously. The advantage of using negative energy is that enormous energy density pulses can be freely had from the local vacuum environment and used, charging the capacitor or battery very stably and much more rapidly than is possible using positive energy. Positive energy flow is always trying to scatter, since it is basically diverging energy. Any slightest obstacle impedance results in more scattering, so that some control is lost and some of the energy so laboriously being held in the flow is scattered away. On the other hand, negative energy flow is always trying to further converge and narrow along its line of travel. Any slightest obstacle impedance to the control that is prohibiting additional convergence, will thus allow more convergence to occur. The result is an amplification of the actual energy flow being propagated, by excess energy converging into the stream of the flow, from the surrounding asymmetrical vacuum. In comparison, positive energy is by nature diverging, while negative energy is by nature converging. Positive energy is by nature heating, while negative energy is by nature cooling. Positive energy is by nature entropic, while negative energy is by nature negentropic. To use positive energy, one must forcibly restrain its heating and dissipation tendency, else one loses the energy and has less or even none left. To use negative energy, one may release the convergence restraints on it, so that one deliberately takes advantage of its natural convergent tendency. By simply releasing the restraints, one thus easily invokes the active environment exchange to furnish even more of the negative energy. One may transduce positive energy to negative energy and vice versa, since theoretically any form of energy can be changed into any other form of energy, so long as the total amount of energy is conserved. A capacitor is such a transducer. Batteries are stabilized by the process of recharging with negative energy. Over their lifetime of recharging by positive, divergent, energy, at the micro level the plates develop roughened chemical coatings, spotty chemical corrosions. Recharging rapidly, that is, with repetitive great power such as 300 kilowatt pulses, with negative energy also rapidly works upon these defect areas, correcting or partially reversing many of them. So the subsequent performance of the battery is enhanced and its lifetime is prolonged. Indeed, a severely deteriorated battery with appreciable corrosion damage can usually be materially rejuvenated easily and efficiently by using negative energy to repeatedly recharge it. By use of negative energy and the E-amp effect, this invention analogously forms a heat pump-like recharging situation, in that two energy reservoirs are provided for the energy necessary to do the recharging or system powering. These are the small positive energy input by the operator, which mostly is used for switching and timing operations that initiate and control the negative energy flow, and the momentary but very large magnitude negative energy input which is obtained via the E-amp effect and used for implosive recharging and restabilization of the battery in a very short time. Corresponding to the use of the compressor to concentrate more heat in a given volume, to enhance its extraction by the heat pump system, in the negative energy system the E-amp effect converges additional energy intensity into the negative energy propagation, thus enhancing its extraction from the external vacuum environment. This also amplifies the cooling effect of the use of negative energy. This invention transduces excess negative energy from the vacuum, via the E-amp effect into positive energy, and uses the positive energy to power conventional loads. Conclusions. The radiant energy engineering process allows very rapid and highly amplified recharging of batteries, capacitors, direct extraction and use of excess electromagnetic energy from the vacuum, work-free engineering of the mass-free field and potential in space prior to its interaction with mass to produce a force, producing coefficient of performance greater than 1 electromagnetic systems and electrical power systems, while rigorously obeying conservation of energy, physics, and thermodynamics, producing coefficient of performance equal to infinity electromagnetic systems and electrical power systems, while rigorously obeying conservation of energy, physics, and thermodynamics, a practical process and method for producing and using negative energy, together with evoking and using the environmental amplification E-amp effect, an entirely new methodology for operating and powering electromagnetic circuits and electrical power systems, and a novel new methodology and set of process, which are complex in their theoretical modeling but which are also simply implemented in practical circuits and electrical power systems. Section 2, Field, Summary and Objects. Introduction. With the necessary background physics and thermodynamics development, we now turn to detailing and describing the invention and its operation. Field of the invention. This invention relates to the fields of battery charging and electrical powering. Specifically, it provides novel processes, methods, and apparatuses for collecting radiant electromagnetic energy from the active quantum mechanical vacuum environment, as opposed to voltage and electron current from a conventional source, and using the collected energy for rapidly charging a charge storage device. The charge storage device can be at least one battery, at least one capacitor, or some combination thereof. Both negative energy and positive energy may be utilized. The invention invokes and exploits a new environmental amplification effect that can occur in resistive and inductive impedances immediately, and in capacitive impedances after a time delay. The excess radiant energy for powering is received from the active vacuum by free asymmetrical Riga Eugeing. The radiant energy is received in non-force field form, non-force field form being the spatial precursor prior to the precursor's interaction with mass to produce a force field. The received radiant energy can be converted into common force field electrical energy to supply electrical power for circuits and loads. In a first embodiment, energy input by the operator, as a conventional first energy source, gates radiant energy from the quantum mechanical active vacuum as an unconventional second input energy source, such that more energy for powering is output than the said energy input by the operator, in a manner analogous to a heat pump but utilizing the vacuum as said second energy input source instead of ambient air temperature. A second embodiment harvests the radiant energy for powering only from the vacuum, in a manner analogous to a solar cell but utilizing the vacuum as its sole energy source instead of ambient solar radiation. Summary of the invention. In view of the limitations now present in the prior art, the present invention provides a new and useful charger for charging charge storage devices and a charging process, as well as a new and useful electrical system power source and powering process, capable of rapidly charging the charge storage devices and also of powering electrical systems and their loads and losses. The invention is simple in construction, conditions and uses the active vacuum as its primary energy source, accepts input energy in a novel and unusual form, transduces the novel input energy and collects it in normal electrical energy form, and then dissipates the collected and transduced electrical energy to power an associated electrical system or device in normal fashion. The present invention uses a natural energy source, the active vacuum with its symmetry broken by strong gradients, not previously utilized in the field, and is thus more universally usable from any other known technology in its operation and in its preparation, acceptance, and use of input energy in novel negative energy form. Thus, the invention has many features not offered by the prior art. The invention relates to a novel way to a charge storage device. In typical embodiments, the charge storage devices can be batteries, capacitors, other similar electrical components, or some combination thereof. In one aspect, the invention makes use of an inductive oscillator in a one-to-one transformer, or alternatively an inductor, to generate a high potential difference across a destination battery. The potential is collected on the plates of a capacitor, then is switched to abruptly discharge gradient results in a burst of extra negative energy from the vacuum, thus charging the battery mostly with negative energy from this latter burst. A major advantage is that the destination battery charges with negative convergent energy, thus remains in a cold condition and has very little outgassing. In a typical application, the total current in the input circuit is no more than 200 mA at any time during the operation of the circuit, while negative energy pulses of 300 kW peak power are used for battery charging with great rapidity. The battery so charged with negative energy also transduces the stored energy into positive energy, and subsequently can be discharged to furnish positive energy to do work in conventional fashion. The invention may utilize any component or means of developing a potential in a capacitor for storage across a battery. The stored potential can then be abruptly discharged across the battery in a potential switching circuit to initiate the burst of negative energy from the vacuum. For developing the potential across the capacitor, the invention may use solar cells, generators, electrostatic machines, other batteries such as the primary source battery mentioned previously, high-energy ignition module. For discharging the potential across the capacitor, the invention may use an silicon-controlled rectifier, metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor, insulated gate bipolar transistor, or other transistor, a contactor relay, or commutator of any kind. A difference potential is developed across the battery so that the semiconductors are in correct polarity when switching the capacitor discharge. NPN or PNP semiconductor devices may be used to perform the switching of the capacitor discharge. Across the battery there is observed primarily a transient discharge in the form of a voltage spike, as the negative energy burst does not register on most positive energy instruments. The greater the number of burst discharges, the greater the amount of negative energy discharged into the battery, and the quicker the battery charges. The invention utilizes the fact that the common potential V as used in electromagnetic theory is actually the point energy density of the volumetric potential, since electrostatic scalar potential is defined as the potential's point intensity determined by its scattering form, that is, potentialization of unit point static charge. The amount of energy W delivered to and collected in the battery depends on the potential's point intensity V and the amount of received charge Q that is present in the battery, by the common equation energy equals voltage multiplied by charge. It does not depend on the amount of current furnished in the discharge. By using mostly negative energy in the discharge, the amount of positive energy current is dramatically reduced while the amount of negative energy current is dramatically increased. Further, by use of extra negative energy input from the vacuum to the circuit, every section of the circuitry having impedance exhibits negative impedance for the negative energy, and thereby becomes an amplifier of the negative convergent energy. This causes additional negative energy to be input into said negative impedances by said active asymmetrical vacuum. The circuitry thus becomes a collection of negative energy amplifiers freely fed at each amplifier by negative energy from the altered local Dirac vacuum, and provides peak power pulses of much greater convergent rather than divergent power than the power input by the operator himself. The battery receiving these powerful negative energy pulses is charged by volumetric development and movement of its own internal lattice and fluid positrons, not by insertion of extra electrons furnished from the external power supply. The fact that the primary input charging energy consists of negative energy allows very high peak power pulses to be received and utilized for charging and transformation to positive energy. The result is that the batteries are primarily charged by excess negative energy triggered from the active vacuum, but also convert their acquired excess negative energy into positive energy, for subsequent powering of circuits and devices in normal fashion. The invention also exploits the fact that any battery-powered circuit actually consists of two independent half circuits rather than a single closed current loop circuit. The two separate half circuits are the external loop from the outer surface of one internal battery plate, out through the terminal attached to that plate, and into and through the external circuit to the other battery terminal, thence to the outside surface of the internal battery plate attached to said latter terminal, and from the surface of one of the battery internal plates, through the internal battery fluid, and to the surface of the other battery internal plate. Internally between the plates, primarily ion current is of interest. Charging with negative energy allows the internal migration of the ion positrons composing the positive charges and said positive ions. The invention thus enables the separation and partial separate movement of said internal migrating positron currents, without concomitant amount of electron or negative ion current. The invention generally comprises a section that periodically discharges a very sharp pulse of electromagnetic energy intensity in a system controlled by a semiconductor that, due to the circuit's use of predominantly negative energy, is connected to the circuitry with polarity reversed, as compared with conventions for semiconductors' polarity in typical circuitry employing positive energy. This results in a sharp pulse of electron-free potential intensity, rather than electron current, thereby sharply increasing the energy density of local spacetime and curving said local spacetime, as well as lifting electrons from the local Dirac, leaving momentarily persistent Dirac holes, negative energy electrons, not positrons. As source charges, these sharply produced negative energy holes in turn produce a sharp pulse of negative energy electromagnetic fields and potentials, spreading at light speed in the local vacuum and interacting directly with the ions inside the battery fluid, and on every point inside it. Hence, a little positive energy and appreciable negative energy are received from the vacuum spacetime directly inside the battery, into the internal battery fluid and its ions, by the reverse-controlled circuit. This sharp pulse of mostly negative energy is directed across a battery or capacitor, reversely to the normal charging polarity, so that the battery or capacitor is impulsively charged with convergent negative energy pulses of up to 300 kilowatts, or even greater peak power. By using convergent negative electromagnetic energy, the positive ions Q in the capacitor or battery will and do accept the negative energy W from voltage V via the mechanism energy equals voltage multiplied by charge, faster than from normal positive energy charges and processes. The reason for the much higher rate is that the triggered negative energy arises directly from the local curved spacetime everywhere inside the battery fluid, thereby reducing the necessity for all the negative energy flow or negative energy propagation to move down a wire or through the circuitry. Instead, much of the negative energy used to charge the battery arises from the asymmetric vacuum, curved spacetime, everywhere throughout the battery fluid, interacting with the local positive ions in said fluid, and this input is augmented by the additional negative input flowing in from the circuitry. Further, the negative energy flowing in from the circuitry is first amplified in said circuitry by all impedance elements encountered en route. Hence the battery or capacitor charges up very rapidly from dual energy inputs, with only a small positive energy electron current paid for by the operator but with two powerful negative energy flows, one which arises freely and directly within the battery fluid itself from said internal curved spacetime and the other which flows through the intervening circuitry to the battery and is freely amplified en route. In short, by suddenly converting the vacuum occupied by the battery fluid into an asymmetric vacuum, the broken symmetry of said vacuum injects very high negative energy into all parts of the battery fluid, adding additional rapid charging of said battery. The charging of the capacitor or battery also converts said negative energy into normal positive electromagnetic energy, and this electrical energy can then be discharged in normal fashion to power circuits, systems or devices. Part of the system load can be such a charging system charging batteries via powerful negative energy pulses, while other batteries power the system normally with positive energy. As the powering batteries start declining due to their steady discharging, freshly charged batteries can be switched in to replace them, and the partially discharged batteries in turn can switch to recharging mode and be quickly recharged using the invention's powerful pulses of negative energy. A short time delay occurs in the battery after the unique potentializing of the positive ions inside the battery fluid. Positive ion currents are much more massive than electron currents, and hence in a capacitive section with negative energy there is a somewhat slowed reaction of the ions as readjustment currents that recharge the battery. However, when the pulse is removed, ends, the inertia of the overpotentialized ions continues their recharging motion for some time thereafter. Additional advantages exist in that, for the component of negative energy that does propagate through the circuitry, the sharp flow of negative energy passing through an impedance, inductive, resistive, or capacitive impedance, section results in the production of a negative impedance effect, or amplifier effect, wherein excess negative energy freely flows into said impedance section from the activated local environment and curved local spacetime, thus amplifying the output of negative energy into the circuit from said curved spacetime and negative impedance section. For the capacitive impedance section, the environmental amplifying effect occurs after a small time delay. The invention thus converts a normal entropic dissipative circuit, for positive energy, into a freely amplifying negentropic circuit for negative energy, a novel function not previously accomplished in any other battery charging or powering system. An analogy with a triode vacuum tube will help illustrate the invention's energy amplification principle. The energy furnished by the operator is not the primary energy charging the battery and directed into the invention system from the altered Dirac-C, but merely a gating and control signal, analogous to how the grid energy of a triode, furnished by the operator, is not the primary energy directed from the cathode to the plate, but only a gating and control signal. In the triode case, the excess energy delivered to the plate over and above the signal energy delivered to the grid, comes from the cathode and its external power supply. Returning to the invention, most of the battery charging energy comes from the external altered vacuum as an extra free external power supply, said vacuum having been suddenly made asymmetrical by the sharp gradient of the pulsed potential furnished by the operator. The system is thus converted to a system far from equilibrium with its active asymmetric vacuum environment, freely receiving excess negative energy from said environment. The Dirac-C in such altered vacuum gradient will have some electrons lifted out, leaving Dirac-C negative energy holes, which serve as source charges producing negative energy electromagnetic fields and potentials. In a normal triode vacuum tube, the operator also has to pay for the excess energy delivered to the target plate by cathode, so the overall coefficient of performance of the triode is coefficient of performance less than 1. In the invention, the operator does not have to pay for the vacuum negative energy delivered to the target battery fluid, so the coefficient of performance is greater than 1. In practice, coefficient of performance equal to 20 to 100 is readily achieved for a system without positive feedback to provide the operator's furnished energy, and higher coefficients of performance are possible with that arrangement with additional tuning and refinements. When positive feedback of some of the system's output positive energy is also used to provide the operator's furnished positive energy input, coefficient of performance equal to infinity is permitted by the laws of physics and thermodynamics of an open system far from equilibrium. Further, this feedback and coefficient of performance equal to infinity are readily achievable by implementing the required governed positive feedback of positive energy. Via the E-amp effect, a multiple stage 1-to-1 transformer actually serves as a powerful negative energy amplifier, with the input energy to the amplifier coming from the active vacuum environment. Multiple stages of such transformers can serve as multistage E-amps. The invention's charged capacitor and the charging battery also increasingly exhibit the E-amp effect after some period of operation. The foregoing has outlined, in general, the physical aspects of the invention and is meant to serve as an aid to better understanding the operation of the system. Significantly, this invention can be embodied in numerous other specific forms in addition to the ones portrayed, without departing from the spirit or essential attributes thereof. Accordingly, reference should be had to the following objects and claims as indicating the scope of the invention but not limiting the embodiments and applications. Objects of the invention. A principal object of the present invention is to condition the local vacuum and curvature of space-time by regauging the local vacuum potential and breaking its symmetry, so as to provide an external source of extra potential electromagnetic energy input to the system or process, in addition to the energy input by the operator or external power source. The availability of an extra free environmental source of input energy overcomes the deficiencies of those prior art devices which require that the operator input and pay for all energy that is input and used to power the system or process, its loads, and its losses. An addition object of the present invention is to take advantage of the usually divergence-free heaviside circuital component of energy flow in the space outside the conductors in a circuit, said circuital form of energy flow being in curled field form. While the divergence of curl is zero in flat spacetime, in sharp gradients, such as strong pulses with sharp rise time and decay time, the local spacetime is curved, although that is not modeled by conventional electrical power engineering and electrodynamics. In a curved spacetime, the vectorial divergence of the curl need not be zero, and so excess electromagnetic energy is freely made available during the peristance of the strong gradient. Hence excess energy does exist in the local curved spacetime, in the form of heaviside curl field energy converted into a mix of mostly curl field energy and some divergence field energy, and where said divergence field energy component is received and utilized in the circuit as an excess energy input freely received from the asymmetrical environment. Moreover, an object of the present invention is to provide an external, conditioned, second energy reservoir, being said conditioned and asymmetrical local vacuum and spacetime, such that the excess energy input to the system or process from said second energy reservoir is also by means of asymmetrical regauging, work-free change of potential, which results in this excess energy being freely received by said system or process in compliance with the gauge freedom principle. The result is a practical mechanism and process that asymmetrically and freely changes, regauges the potential energy collected in the system, and then uses this collected extra regauging potential energy as part or all of the energy dissipated by the system or process to power said system or process, its loads and losses. Another object of the present invention is to provide said external extra energy reservoir, such that by sharply pulsing said altered environment, a strong gradient is established between said extra energy reservoir and the system or process. As recognized in non-equilibrium thermodynamics, said strong gradient places the system far from equilibrium in its energy exchange with said active asymmetric environment, and thus violates the equilibrium assumed by the second law of thermodynamics, thereby establishing a free flow of ordered energy from said external energy reservoir to the system or process for its collection, transduction, and further usage. However, as also recognized, the mechanism by which the strong gradient violates the second law of thermodynamics has not been previously understood either experimentally or theoretically, as pointed out by Kondeputy and Prigozhin in their definitive book, Modern Thermodynamics, 1999, page 459. The present invention uses part of the unknown aspects. Another object of the present invention is to freely provide said external extra energy reservoir, and said strong gradient, so that Dirac electrons are lifted from the local vacuum, leaving momentarily persisting unfilled Dirac holes as negative energy electrons, further acting as source charges. Another object of the present invention is to provide said Dirac holes as momentarily persisting source charges, whereby said source charges pour out negative energy electromagnetic fields and potentials via the asymmetry of the charges and the polarized vacuum with opposite virtual charges, and wherein said negative energy electromagnetic fields and potentials and their negative energy are input to said system and process and interact with it, and where said negative energy cools the processes instead of heating them. Another object of the present invention is to provide said input energy from said free source of electromagnetic negative energy in a sharply pulsed form, wherein said input pulsed negative energy is convergent rather than divergent, and wherein far more such convergent energy can be conducted without damage along the conductors per size than is possible with positive energy, and wherein the greater magnitude of convergent pulsed negative energy can be used to help charge a battery or capacitor up to 50 or more times faster than can be accomplished by using divergent positive energy. Another object of the present invention is that, through using negative energy rather than positive energy to charge the batteries or power the E-amp circuit, the batteries or the E-amp circuit are not heated or damaged, but are cooled, even though very high peak power pulses of 300 kilowatts or more can be utilized for implosive charging. Another object of the present invention is to provide said negative energy impulsive charging, which also can serve to perpetually rejuvenate and reverse many kinds of deterioration and cumulative internal damage of said battery or capacitor, by partially reversing previous damage or deterioration due to positive energy charging, thus improving and extending the life cycle of the component thus charged. Another object of the present invention is to provide said negative energy impulsive charging, with partial rejuvenation of previous battery or capacitor damage or deterioration from positive energy charging, such that the mean time between failure for said battery or capacitor can be extended, and wherein said system mean time between failure is extended accordingly. Another object of the present invention is to utilize said flow of negative energy through resistive and inductive conducting paths to a capacitive collector or battery, such that said resistive and inductive elements immediately act as environmentally driven negative resistors and as cooling environmental amplifiers E-amps for said negative energy input flow along said path, further adding excess negative energy from the environment to the negative energy flow received by the collecting battery or capacitor. Another object of the present invention is to utilize said flow of negative energy through capacitive sections such as capacitors and the battery itself, such that said capacitive elements also act as environmentally driven negative resistors after a time-delayed operational period, and thus serve as additional environmental amplifiers E-amps for said negative energy input flow along said path, further adding excess negative energy from the environment to the negative energy flow received by the collecting battery or capacitor. Another object of the present invention is to utilize the battery charging or capacitor charging in what for positive energy would be a reversed polarity. Another object of the present invention is to widely application in cooling of circuitry, as well as for general refrigeration. The future incorporation of negative energy circuits into the fabrication of microchips, both for self-powering and self-cooling, is expected to provide significant reduction in size and costs of great assemblies of microcircuits, presently limited by heating effects and necessity for separate cooling. Another object of the present invention is to utilize said capacitor or battery charging in reversed polarity, so that said battery or capacitor, when charging acts as a transducer of the received impulsive negative energy, transducing the rapidly received negative energy into stored positive energy added to said battery or capacitor, without incurring the heating and damage that would result from use of positive energy charging pulses of such high peak power. The overall result is that said battery or capacitor receives negative energy impulsively and strongly at up to a few hundred kilowatts in peak power or peak energy flow rate, peak charging rate, while simultaneously transducing the rapidly received excess negative energy into excess stored positive electromagnetic energy. In this manner, the battery or capacitor is very rapidly charged with excess transduced positive energy, up to 50 or more times faster than can be done with direct input of positive energy rather than input of negative energy, use of free environmental amplification of the input negative energy by impedance sections, and conversion to stored positive energy as the battery is charged by negative energy. Another object of the present invention is to accomplish negative energy input and charging where said resulting transduced stored positive energy is substantially greater in magnitude than the positive energy input provided by the operator to evoke and utilize said process and mechanism. The excess energy is freely received in the excess negative energy input from the environment and through the environmental amplification effect, so that overall conservation of energy is obeyed at all times. Another object of the present invention is to provide said pulsed negative energy rapid charging method and system wherein the charged battery or capacitor transduces the implosively input negative energy into conventional positive electromagnetic energy, thus increasing the stored energy in said system or process as normal positive energy, although it was impulsively received from said external extra environmental energy source as negative energy amplified by resistive and inductive elements. En route to the battery or capacitor collector. Another object of the present invention is to provide a system or process whereby negative energy is freely received from an externally conditioned environment, and where a combination of batteries or capacitors is used, and where one part of said combination is used in the role of a receiver-collector transducer for the incoming negative energy while simultaneously a second combination of batteries or capacitors is used in a positive energy discharging and powering role for powering said system or process with normal positive energy, and wherein periodically the aforementioned roles of the devices are swapped so that freshly charged batteries or capacitors are placed into the role of positive energy powering units, and simultaneously the somewhat depleted batteries or capacitors formerly used in a powering role are placed into the receiver-collector transducer charge receiving role to be rapidly pulse charged via the environmentally amplified impulsive negative energy mechanism and process of the invention. The result is a continuously powered system freely taking most or all of its required input energy from the external active vacuum energy reservoir. Another object of the present invention is to provide a system or process wherein the system or circuit is converted into a non-equilibrium system, freely receiving and utilizing excess energy from its active environment in a manner analogous to a common home heat pump with two energy reservoirs, one furnished by the operator and the other furnished freely from the environment. Analogous to how a heat pump expends a little energy to compress the air and thus extract a greater amount of energy than was expended to compress the air, the invention processes and asymmetrically conditions the external vacuum and curved space-time environment in order to extract more energy than the positive energy required to condition and process said environment. Another object of the present invention is to provide said system or process wherein the power input by the operator is also further made a part of the system or process load, so that the system or process becomes self-powering in that no further energy input by the operator is required, and all energy input used in said system or process is furnished from the external conditioned environment via free asymmetrical regauging of the system's potential energy, analogous to the operation of a conventional system powered by a solar cell array in a solar radiation environment, except that the active environment is now the conditioned local vacuum and curved space-time. Another object of the present invention is to provide a means of conditioning and affecting the fields and potentials of its external environment while they have not interacted with charged mass and thus are still in force-free and mass-free form. By this means, the invention is able to interact and condition its active environment via free regauging, without the requirement to do work, since there is no force involved in said reconditioning and hence no translation of force through a distance, which would require work. This invention deliberately exploits the present error in classical electrodynamics that assumes a force field in space by assuming that space contains the mass of a luminiferous material ether, the ubiquitously assumed unit point charge at each spatial point, more than a century after the Michelson-Morley experiments destroyed said material ether. The textbook definition of said electromagnetic fields, their intensities, still retains a unit point charge and its mass in the interaction, hence still retains the material ether, although leading physicists such as Nobelist Feynman have pointed out the error. The invention also exploits the fact that normal classical electrodynamics and electrical engineering do not calculate and use the field and potential themselves as such, but only calculate the static charge intercepted point intensity of said field and the point intensity of said potential, and that the standard model erroneously assumes that a unit point static charge containing mass has been placed at every point in space, and also assumes the massless field in mass-free space is in ongoing interaction with the mass of said static charge. The present invention interacts with mass-free fields and potentials, the precursors of the material fields and potentials used in conventional electrical engineering and devices, and which precursors subsequently interact with mass to form the actual electromagnetic force fields in the absence of any point unit charge, so that Riga-Eugene is the reaction utilized, not force field reaction with charged mass. This is a totally new electromagnetic function utilized in the invention, and this function does not appear to have previously been deliberately used in any prior art. The invention primarily interacts with and changes the mass-free precursor of the force field, not the force field itself. Changing a force field requires thermodynamic work since it is a material external parameter of the system, while changing the precursor to the force field does not require thermodynamic work since the precursor is not a material external parameter of the system itself, but merely a characteristic of the local spacetime and the local vacuum. Thus the invention interacts directly and work-free to change the virtual particle flux of the local active vacuum and the local curvature of spacetime, freely changing them by Riga-Eugene under the gauge freedom principle. This directly alters the vacuum flux and spacetime curvature precursor of force field and potential, and said altered precursor then interacts with the charged mass in the system or process so that altered force fields and altered potentials in the charged mass of the system are freely obtained, compared to what would have been present without the interaction and change of said altered precursor. This is a direct application of the principle that there does not exist in nature any conservation of work law, but only a conservation of energy law, and force interaction is not necessary to merely change potential energy or field energy, since such can be changed freely by Riga-Eugene. With Riga-Eugene, energy is conserved at all times but local work done on and by the system need not be conserved, since the potential energy increases of the system or process are accomplished by Riga-Eugene and are permissibly and freely made under the gauge freedom axiom in work-free manner. Another object of the present invention is to provide a system or process wherein radiant energy here referring to potential and field energy in force-free and thus mass-free form, and thus in the precursor form prior to formation of force fields and normal potentials already interacting with charged mass, is used in the primary precursor functions of said system or process, rather than with force field energy and potentials that are already interacting with charged mass. This is a totally new electrodynamic system and process function not utilized in the prior art. Another object of the present invention is to provide a system capable of charging a charge storage device, or an electrical powering system or process, that is partially or totally powered by energy freely received from its external vacuum environment, and thus is more universally functional in today's market, and in diverse locations and environments, than the prior art devices wherein the operator must provide and pay for all the input energy. Another object of the present invention is to provide a system capable of charging a charge storage device, or an electrical powering system or process, that is partially or totally powered by energy freely received from its external vacuum environment, thus reducing or eliminating the need for, and cost of, external fuel, pipelines, external power sources, transmission lines from a centralized power distribution grid, and storage and transportation costs for fuel and fuel support and processing facilities. Another object of the present invention is to provide said novel system or process, or primary power source, whereby only standard electronic parts and supplies are utilized and required, and whereby only normal construction and manufacturing capabilities, procedures, and workforces are required, so that initial acquisition costs for the new chargers and power systems are highly competitive. Further, the great reduction in support costs such as fuel, transport, and storage costs, together with extended battery and system life and increase of mean time between failures, make the new system much cheaper to operate than prior art devices. Another object of the present invention is to provide a battery charging and capacitor charging system and process, and an electrical power system, wherein a 1-to-1 transformer operates as an environmental amplifier for negative energy, and freely increases the input negative energy by free regauging from the external active environment. Another object of the present invention is to utilize a standard circuit, containing normal electronic components, in a novel manner, whereby negative energy rather than positive energy comprises the main energy flow in the circuit and interacts with it from the external environment, and whereby all sections of said circuitry having impedance, being resistance, capacitance, or inductance or any combination thereof, and comprised of any types of electronic components whatsoever, also act as free amplifiers such that excess negative energy is freely input to the negative energy flow in the circuit, from the external environment via the impedance sections. Another object of the present invention is to provide a battery charging and capacitor charging system and process, and an electrical power system, wherein the input of excess environmental energy is in the form of powerful negative energy pulses. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, wherein a full-wave rectifier is used to produce all positive going or all negative going energy input pulses from said active environment. Another object of the present invention is to provide a system or process, whereby the useful output is usually greater at nighttime, or during periods of geophysical upset of environment, than in daytime, but wherein conventional means are included to regulate the varying output to the output that is required or needed. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, wherein an silicon-controlled rectifier or other solid-state semiconductor device is utilized in reverse to switch the negative energy pulses. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, wherein a triac or other device similar in bidirectional functioning is utilized to take advantage of negative energy flowing in an opposite direction from that of positive energy, under the same circuit potential or field conditions. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, wherein a neon tube or other discharge device is utilized to switch the negative energy pulses. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, primarily using negative energy freely received from the asymmetric vacuum environment, wherein the full variety of normal electrical loads can be powered, such as motors, generators, electronic circuits, and other systems and processes. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, primarily using negative energy freely received from the asymmetric vacuum environment, wherein the standard closed current loop system is altered to become an open dissipative thermodynamic system freely receiving excess energy, in negative energy form, from its active environment, the active local vacuum and local curved space-time. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, wherein the system or process does not output or introduce radioactive or chemical wastes, harmful exhausts, carbon dioxide, unwanted radiation, or chemical pollution byproducts into the environment. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, wherein the cooling negative entropy effect of negative energy offsets or counterbalances the heating effect of the entropy powering components and loads, thus substantially reducing or eliminating net heat production released into the environment, which together with no emission of carbon dioxide substantially reduces the contributions to global warming of electrically powered processes and systems using the invention. The use of a negentropic process to furnish extra energy automatically provides a net reduction of waste heat released into the environment. Another object of the present invention is to provide power and propulsion systems for electrically powered vehicles, trucks, ships, trains, aircraft, ships and other transport systems that do not consume hydrocarbon fuel or utilize nuclear propulsion systems, and do not produce harmful byproducts, emissions, and pollutants into the environment, while also reducing or eliminating the net heat released into the environment. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, wherein the silicon-controlled rectifier or solid-state semiconductor is replaced by a neon tube, plasma tube, transistor, or other discharge device to discharge the pulses of negative energy in radiant energy form. Many other variations are possible, so long as the primary principles of the extraction, amplification, and conversion of negative energy in radiant energy form are implemented. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, wherein any external source of voltage such as an elevated antenna wire can provide the potential required to charge the battery or capacitor with environmental negative energy obtained freely via regauging, and thus power the process or system and its loads and losses. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, wherein a suitable timer and switching, such as a 555 timer together with an optical coupling switching device, are utilized to time the switching of the negative energy pulses of radiant energy. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, wherein a series resonant high voltage switching circuit is utilized to time and switch the negative energy pulses of radiant energy. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and power supply, and said switching and timing subsystems, and said collector transducer systems, whereby the freely received negative energy pulses from the active environment are received at peak power levels of a few hundred kilowatts of power input without damage to the devices being charged. Another object of the present invention is to provide said charging system and process, and powering system, in a form easily scaled down for small packages powering miniature and small systems such as watches, clocks, and laptop computers, and electrical appliances, or easily scaled up for large packages powering large and very large systems such as electric automobiles, electric trains and trucks, electric airplanes, and electric ships and submarines, and large power systems regulating building-sized capacitors used in main power grid demand-filling applications. It is intended that any other advantages and objects of the present invention that become apparent or obvious from the detailed description or illustrations contained herein are within the scope of the present invention.